I am a descendant of Jack and Molly Bailey, who were former slaves in the state of Tennessee, West Tennessee. Their family, 5 boys and 5 girls, grew up in that area down in what is called Persimmon Grove Road. That's in Gibson County, West Tennessee. There was an area of about 5 miles from one area to the next that was a totally black, rural community. All the people who lived in that particular area were blacks, and that began after the Civil War. Black people at that time could not purchase land anywhere other than where the white establishment wanted them to live. So these people, these black families, including my grandmother and grandfather, came into this area, purchased the land, felled the trees, builded the log cabins, and set up a community in that area for themselves and their families. And they were very thriving people. They developed everything of their own there in that community. My grandfather, Jack Bailey, was one of the key persons in that community. He was a blacksmith. He was an undertaker. He had the old horse-drawn hearse. He and his sons, including my father, built the caskets for the people who passed on in those days, that day and age. And they thrived through that kind of situation. The community was a close-knit one. They had a cotton gin, they had a sawmill, and other kinds of sorghum machines, those kinds of things. And all the people and families in that community worked together in just about everything they did. Clearing the land, rolling the logs, hewing the logs for the cabins, and that kind of thing. It was an outstanding situation. Interestingly enough, my father and his brothers and sisters, as well as many other people in that community who grew up in that community at that time, remained there. And my father, this is the interesting part of it, my father met my mother, who was the daughter of the school teacher. They had the school teacher, and they called him Mr. Midget, which was my grandfather. The school teacher came and brought his daughters, and he had several, to the church, to the school picnic. And that's where my father met my mother. And he said at that time, I'm going to marry that girl. And he did. And that's, after they were married, they purchased land in that same area. And on this farm where my mother and father built a home and established a family was where I was born and reared. And it was just an outstanding situation in that community called Persimmon Grove Road. Many, many families and descendants of those families are still there. Some of them are still there. And each 2 years, we, the Bailey family, the descendants of the Jack and Molly Bailey family, return to our roots for a family reunion. This last July, we were there and spent a weekend. There were over 200 Baileys, descendants of the Jack and Molly Bailey family, from all over the country, including foreign countries, came back home to celebrate the family reunion. So that's where I came from. I was the first, interestingly enough, and it just so happened, you know, there's a thing where you're being in the right place at the right time. I was the first youngster male to finish high school, not only in my Jack and Molly Beatty family descendants, but in that total community. I was also the first to go to college. That kind of drive was passed on to me through my father, but coming from my mother. My maternal grandfather, my mother's father, if I may go back to that, his father was a white man. His mother was a slave girl. She lived in the house with the family. And the white man fathered my grandfather. Well, that was rather common practice in that day and time. No real problem, apparently. The white mother just took the boy as a member of the household, taught him to read and write. And his father sent him away to what was called, not a college in those days, but Roger Williams Institute in Nashville, Tennessee. Paid his tuition, the whole thing, involvement, for him to have an education. And he was graduated from Roger Williams Institute. It was called an institute at that time, but it was about the equivalent of a high school. So we have in our archives his certificate of graduation from that institution. He returned then to the local community where he was born and reared and taught school all of his life. He was the local school teacher. The father of my mother and I believe 5 other girls, I think there were 6 altogether, and there were 6 or 7 boys. Large families back in those days. 13 or 14 members of the family. My maternal grandfather, who was a school teacher, his father, the white man, gave to his mother, the former slave girl, a whole section of land. Down in Crockett County, Tennessee, near what is now the county seat of that county, Alamo. Those names came from David Crockett and from the Battle of the Alamo. So she lived there and reared her children and made a life for them. My grandfather then purchased land and taught school all through the years until he passed on. Our mother passed on when I was 3 years old. Following World War I, when I had this flu epidemic and thousands of people in the United States passed on as a result of that, my mother was one of them. She told my father that she wanted at least the boys to have a good education like her father, My mother passed on when she was very young. She was only in her 30s. And there were 7 of us, 3 girls and 4 boys. I'm the 5th member of the family. We had 3 girls, Clarence, the oldest, Gladys, and Claudine. And then my brother Gilbert and myself, my brother Robert, and my brother Raymond. All are gone now except myself and my brother Robert. I just knew I was going to college. Yeah, knew I was going to college. Had to go. Nothing going to stop me. I decided that that was what I was going to do. Down in Tennessee at that time, the education for black children was very poor. We would have about 3 months of education during the fall and winter, and then we would close school for the spring, plowing and planting and cultivating and that kind of thing. And then in the summer months, when it was the hottest time, we had finished with the crops, we would go back to school for another 2 or 3 months, like maybe in July, August, and the early part of September. And by this time, it's time to harvest cotton. And this was a cotton country. So, in spite of that, we were able to survive. We had what's called a Persimmon Grove School. This community, they had its church, school, the whole bit. I mean, it was a self-contained community for all the black people in that area. And that's where I started school. And that's where I kept going through school until I was finished through the 8th grade. In that time, in that day and time, education for black kids was not very important. If you got an education through the 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade, that was satisfactory. My father, the education was about 5th grade. My oldest brother had about 5th grade. None of my sisters were able to get education beyond, well, Claudine, Clarence and Gladys had about 4th or 5th grade education, the oldest 2. Claudine did complete 10th grade. So when I completed the school that was available to me at that time in that place, I prevailed on my father to let me come to St. Louis to live with my oldest sister and brother, who by that time had migrated to St. Louis and had established their families and were, although they were living, I put it that way, they were living that. So he did. I came to St. Louis then in 1933. And there's a whole history of up to 33 that I won't go into, but anyway, I came to St. Louis in 33. I entered Vashon High School in 33. And I graduated in 35. I completed a 4-year high school at Vashon in St. Louis in 2 school years and 2 summers. I completed a 4-year high school. And after high school, I wanted to go to college, so I was a paper boy. The St. Louis Argus paper. I was a paper boy, had my own customers and all. That was the way I made it in that day. So I earned 15 to 20 cents, you know, and that was a lot of money. But I went down to the St. Louis Argus building, and I talked to Mr. Mitchell, who was the owner and operator of the paper. I told him that I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to go to college. And at the same time, I had been working for an individual in St. Louis, Mr. Smith. There I learned to do painting, plumbing, and carpentry, and those kinds of things. And it was he who urged me to go talk to Mr. Mitchell. I went in and talked to Mr. Mitchell, and I told him who I was and what I was doing and all, and I said I want to go to college. He said, "You really want to go to college?" I told him, "Yes." He said, "Well, if I help you get in college, will you make good of it?" I said, "Yes." He picked up his telephone and he called Jefferson City, Missouri, Lincoln University, and talked to the president, whose name was Mr. Florence at that time. He talked to Mr. Florence and he said to him, "I have a boy who wants to go to school, go to college. He wants to be a doctor." He says, "Can he enter up there?" And I don't know what Mr. Florence said. I guess he said yes. He says, "Okay, he'll be there in the morning." So that was such a shock to me. I came home and I told my brother and my sisters that I was going to college, and I had to go that night and get there the next morning. I didn't have any way to get there. I didn't have bus fare or anything. So my brothers and sisters, I don't know, scrapped up enough money to give me my bus fare to college. I took the bus that night, arrived in Jefferson City like about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. I often think of this. I got off the bus in Jefferson City, and I had a little bag with all my clothing in there. Just a small thing, you know. I started walking away, and there was a fellow there with a cab driver. He said, "Hey, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going up to Lincoln University." He said, "Do you know where Lincoln is?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, how are you going to get there?" I said, "I'm going to walk." He said, "Well, I tell you what, you come on, I'll drive you out there." Okay, I got in the cab with him. He drove me out to Lincoln University, which was quite a distance away from the bus stop. And he says, "I'll take you over to the freshman dormitory." No, he said, "Where do you want to go?" I said, "I want to go to see the president." He said, "You can't see the president this time of morning." He says, "Let me take you over to the freshman dormitory, and you see the president tomorrow morning." So I said, "Okay." He took me over to the freshman dormitory and charged me $1 to drive out there. And I went down to the dormitory and I knocked on the door. I knocked on the door, I knocked and knocked and knocked and knocked. So finally, a young man came to the door and he said to me, "Fella, what in the world are you doing standing here knocking on this door?" I said, "I wanted to get in." He said, "Well, come on in. The door's open." So I walked in and spent the rest of the night with him. The following morning, I went over to see the president. Went to the president's office and told him who I was. And interestingly enough, that same morning, as I was walking down the campus to go to the president's, you can't ever guess who I met. My wife. Yes, she came walking up the stairs, and I spoke to them and all, and then I went into the president's office. She was coming up the hill to go to class. So I went into the president's office and told him who I was and everything. He said, "Well," he says, "how much money do you have?" I said, "No, I don't have any money." He said, well, how in the world do you think you're going to go to school without any money? I said, well, Mr. Mitchell called you and told you he was sending me up here to go to school, and I don't have anybody to support me. He said, well, you just can't expect to come here and go into college and not have any money. So he said, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a 1-month board book for the cafeteria. And I'm going to sign you up for your classes. But it says, you're going to have to get some money in here from somewhere, somehow. I said, well, I'll do the best I can. So I then entered the classes. Didn't have money to buy books. Managed somehow to get my hand on some used books. And, and I was stupid enough at that time to elect to take. This is what I elected to take. And I had to take English. I had college algebra and German and chemistry and let's see, and a social science. Those 5 subjects. 5 subjects. Well, I managed to hang in there. When the first quarter came to take examination, I flunked flat on my face because I really wasn't prepared to go to college. I hadn't been accustomed to that kind of freedom. I was on my own, and I studied if I wanted to. If I didn't, I'd just leave it go. I didn't have the support that I needed to succeed. But then I was called in and told that if I didn't improve my grades, that I would not only be dismissed from school, that I would still have all this money to pay. So that shook me up, And I decided, well, I'm here. I'm going to make it. So I buckled down. By the end of the semester, I had earned 4 D's, 4 C's, and a D in those 5 subjects. That was enough to keep me in school. Prior to that time, though, I saw a young man painting one of the buildings on campus. I walked over and asked him, who hired him. He told me. So I said, okay, thanks. And I went over to this person's office, and I asked him if I could. I said, I'm a painter, and I'd like to get a job painting for you. He says, well, I don't have any job right now. He says, where are you from? I told him. He said, how long have you been here? I told him. He said, and I said, I've got to get an education. I've got to earn some money to pay my way. So he said, well, you come back to see me later. All right, the next week I went back to see him, and the same thing. The 3rd week, I put on my work clothes and my work shoes, the whole bit, and I walked into his office on Saturday morning. And I said, I came to work today. He looked up at me, he says, I haven't hired you. I said, I know you haven't, but you told me to come back to see you. Now, I came back here, now I'm here to work. He said, you got an awful lot of guts. He says, I tell you what I want you to do. You say you're a painter, huh? I said, yes. He said, I want you to go back in the shop and mix paint, and told me what color to make it and all that. And when you get that done, you come back to me. I went in, I knew exactly what to do because I had been taught that by Mr. Smith. I mixed the paint. I came back and told him I have it ready. He says, okay, you go down to this classroom and I want you to paint the ceiling in this room. So, all right. I got on a ladder and I painted and painted and painted. So at noon, this was on Saturday, at noon, he came and said, well, that's all we're going to do for today. I told him, okay. So he went away to his home. I came back after lunch and finished painting that ceiling. And he came in and said, what in the world, I thought you were supposed to go to lunch. I said, I did. But I said, I'm finishing the job. He said, we don't work but a half day on Saturday. I said, does it matter whether you work a half day or a whole day? I said, I need to earn money to pay my way through college. He said, I've never heard anybody with that kind of guts. He says, I tell you what, you got a job. So you report back to me Monday morning, bring your class assignments, and then I'll work in your work schedule around that. So that continued through that semester. And as I said, at the end of the semester, I had the 4 C's and a D. And during the Christmas time, I couldn't come home because I didn't have the money for the train fare or bus fare. So this man came to me and said, what are you going to do during the Christmas vacation? I said, sit around here on the campus with those who can't go home as I am. He said, well, I tell you what I want you to do. I want you to come down and paint my kitchen. Okay. I went down to his house on Lafayette Street there in Jefferson City, and I painted his kitchen. When I finished with the kitchen, he was so pleased with the work, he said, I'll just let you do the whole house. So I did the whole house on the interior. And I shall never forget, he paid me $35 for the job. $35 was a lot of money. So I took that $35 and came back to campus. When we reopened school after the Christmas holidays, I paid my bills up. I went downtown, I bought myself some pajamas, something that I never had before in my life. Brought toothbrush and toothpaste. I never had a toothbrush in my life. All the kinds of necessities, shirts and underwear and those kinds of things that I needed, I purchased them out of that $35 and still had a few dollars left. After that, it was rather smooth sailing. I got my feet on the ground. I learned my way around. I never had a D after that. At this college, there were courses available to students to prepare themselves for any walk of life. Okay? I wanted to be a doctor in the worst possible way. But when I was graduated from college, getting into medical school was almost an impossibility, because at that time, as I recall, there were only 2 black medical schools in the whole United States. That was Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, and Howard University in Washington, D.C. Lincoln University at that time was a very closely knit organization in that the faculty, everyone from the president down to the custodians, cafeteria workers, whoever was involved in the operation of Lincoln University at that time, was one big family. And everybody looked out for everybody else. Had it not been that way, many of the students at that time would not have made it, including myself. So it was a closely knit family situation, and it made it very good for everybody involved. I was very fortunate, however, to come up through an environment such as that, because there were a lot of people, many people, who gave me a helping hand. And made it possible for me to be where I am today. So I abandoned the idea of being a doctor and I settled for being a teacher. Teaching jobs were difficult to find at that day and time, but fortunately, I ultimately graduated with a degree in industrial arts education. And although there weren't too many black schools in the state of Illinois, black high schools in the state of Illinois, not the state of Missouri, that had what they call, quote, shop. But there were a few. And I was fortunate enough to get employment as a teacher at Mexico, Missouri, which was about 40 miles north of Jefferson City. So we moved to that town. Let me throw in something else. While we were doing all that, she and I were going together real strong, real strongly. And then we decided to get married after I graduated, you know. Didn't have a place to stay, no place to go or anything, so we got married. We were married October 30th of 1935, 38. And then we moved to Mexico, Missouri. And we taught school there for 3 years. And then I applied for a teaching position here in Alton, Illinois. And I came here in 1942. Came to Alton in 1942 as a teacher at LOVEJOY School on Union Street. I taught math, science, and shop, and coached basketball at LOVEJOY Junior High School. We were there for, I think, about 3 years, and then I was promoted to assistant principal of the school. And the next year, I was promoted to principal of the school. And from there on, it was just a matter of being in the right place at the right time for the various promotions and so on that went all the way up to assistant superintendent of schools of Alton School District. When I came to LOVEJOY School in 1942, I believe there was Mr. Lewis, Mr. W.B. Lewis, who was principal of the school, Mr. Joseph A. Brewer was a teacher in the school. He was band and music, and myself. That was it at that time when I came. 3 men. And I believe about maybe 7 or 8 or 9 women. After I taught for, I believe, maybe 2 or 3 years, and I was promoted to assistant principal of LOVEJOY School at the time. The school district got itself involved in a desegregation plan situation. You see, prior to that time, during that time and prior to that time, the Alton School District was segregated, had segregated schools for black children up through the 9th grade. And following the 9th grade, 10th, 11th, and 12th, they attended the integrated high school, Alton Senior High School. During that particular time, the pressure was brought to bear upon the Alton School District to completely desegregate the schools. There was tremendous amount of resistance to that. Of course, it was to be expected. However, there was a court ruling and was passed on to the then Superintendent and Board of Education to give them a sufficient amount of time to desegregate the schools, and the Board of Education agreed with it. In essence, it was a step-down program, starting with the 9th grade. All right, all 9th graders would go to integrated schools or desegregated schools. And then the next year there'd be the 8th grade, and the next year the 7th grade, and so on. Well, that worked very satisfactorily for 3 or 4 years. In the meantime, there was so much pressure brought to bear upon the Board of Education to just completely desegregate the schools that the board decided, well, what we will do, we'll give it an open door enrollment. In other words, a family of 4, if the child in the 9th grade had to go to a desegregated school and the others were in the 7th, 6th, and 5th, they too could go. So that really backfired on the Board of Education because it overloaded the desegregated schools and reduced the enrollments dramatically in the segregated schools. We had teachers in the segregated schools with 17, 18, 20 students enrolled. And then the desegregated schools, the teachers were 35 and 36 and 38. Well, they decided, well, this isn't working, so what we'll do, we'll just desegregate the whole thing. In the meantime, there was a problem with what to do with the teachers. That was a big problem. What do we do with the teachers? Well, if you're going to desegregate schools, you're going to desegregate schools. That includes teachers. The Board of Education didn't feel that the community or the white community was ready for a black teacher to teach their children. Well, my position was, you know, we received our education from the same institutions as the rest of them. We have the same degrees, we meet the same qualifications for certification. And we are teachers. So what difference does it make, you know? Well, the then superintendent told me personally, he said, Jim says, I don't know what would happen if I put you in a classroom out at the Alton High School. I said, sir, we'll never know until we try it, will we? Okay? So what he did then was to transfer, I believe I'm right in saying that he transferred one black teacher for each school in the elementary division. And that just about absorbed the black elementary teachers. Did the same thing with the junior high, 7th, 8th, 9th grade. He had one teacher, I believe, at East and West, and one at West and one at North. And then at the high school, they transferred 2 people there. One was James Washington. They gave him a position of being counselor. And myself as assistant principal in charge of, quote, the annex building at that time. And it was a kind of funny thing when they transferred me over to the Alton High School. Not only did they expect me to be the person who would keep the black children and black students in their proper place. Keep them in their proper place, you know. So I had to tell the principal and the superintendent and other members who were involved that I didn't come to Alton High School to keep the black children in their place. I came under the impression that my position was for all students. And as long as I'm here in this position, that's the direction that I'm going to follow. I'm going to be assistant principal for all students. Yes, I'll chastise the black students if they get out of line, but I'll also chastise the white students if they get out of line. Okay? So that's the way it's going to be. And you know, if it can't be that way, then you move me to some other position, someplace else, where we won't be faced with that problem. And it worked out very well. As a matter of fact, it exceeded all of the expectations of the administration, the then Board of Education. It's just remarkable. I proposed to the then principal and Board of Education and superintendent and administrators that Alton High School at the time was a 3-building campus. You have a principal and you have 3 assistant principals. Okay, let's do it this way. Let's have each assistant principal to be in complete charge of his building. Okay, the principal is going to be in charge of the whole thing, but each assistant principal will be in complete charge of his building. At the same time, each assistant principal will be in complete charge of a class. And including in that class all of the counselors that are assigned to that class. Well, this was completely unheard of, but they agreed to it, and it worked exceptionally well. Exceptionally well. Everyone in the building of the quote annex, where I was the assistant principal, was responsible directly to me as principal of that building. Every student who came into that building was responsible directly to me and my staff in that building. All of the counselors who were in charge of my class, and each principal take a class, first year class, and remain with that class until it graduates, and then come back and get the beginning class. And that was a terrific situation to work out at that time, and it served the purpose very, very well, very well. I had a wonderful experience as assistant principal at Alton High School. There were problems, of course, but you know, we'll have problems anytime, anywhere, most any school system. During that time, we were, well, the total community, not only the total community, but the nation at that time was really facing up to and experiencing civil rights movements. And that situation brought to bear upon not only the student body of the Alton High School, but the administration as well, some serious problems insofar as how we're going to handle this situation. And we did, unfortunately, have some uprisings during that time. at Alton High. Nothing serious, but there were some racial uprisings at that time. Now my role, as looked upon by the majority of the black students at that time, was that kind of a role model, protector, somebody to go to when I need help, those kinds of things. But honestly, on the other side of the other page of the book, there were those who disliked me, who called me Uncle Tom, a white folks nigger, if you excuse that expression. You know, you just here to do what they tell you to do, you know, that kind of thing. Well, I had to live through that, and by actions and by relationship with those students, they learned that that really was not my role at Alton High. I'll never forget one day I had several students in my office for misconduct at the school, and there were about 3 white boys and 2 or 3 black students. Well, I said, this is the time for me to show who I am, you know. So I chewed the white boys out one at a time and suspended them to school in the presence of these black boys. And then I turned to the black boys and said, now it's your turn. I chewed them out and suspended them for a certain period of time. I said, now, you understand what my role is here. My role is for students, all students, black and white. During my sojourn as a school administrator up through the years, particularly during the period of time that I was at Alton High School and later as an administrator at the Board of Education office, I encountered quite often experiences that tended to place me in a position of isolation from not only the white community but the black community as well. And it was just a matter of having a thick skin to be able to survive and overcome those kinds of situations. During all this time, I experienced situations which were perpetrated purposely, I'm sure, to block my movement along the way. For example, while at Alton High School and being one of 3 assistant principals, there suddenly became a time when the principal and the assistant principal would retire. And they knew that they were going to retire. All right, and that was the principal of the total program, a total 3 buildings, and the assistant principal in the main. That left 2 of us in line. My next move automatically would have been to the principalship of the high school. But the then superintendent and administration and Board of Education just weren't ready for a black person to be principal of the high school. It was okay to be assistant principal over this one building managing the total building and everything. It's okay to be that, but be principal over the whole thing, no. So what they did was created a position for me at the Board of Education office. It was a big promotion. We're going to promote you from assistant principal of high school to an administrative assistant superintendent. Well, I saw through that right away. But what choice did I have? You know, I either take that or I move on. And at that stage of my life, I wasn't ready to move on. I guess I was afraid to move on. So I took the position. The superintendent of schools at that time was J.B. Johnson. And J.B. Johnson was a person who, he was an autocrat. He ruled with an iron hand the school district. He ran the school district. And whatever he said, the board approved. And he ran it that way. So they created this position for me, gave me an office, a secretary, a big improvement in my salary, and with nothing to do. With nothing to do. I tell my wife, every payday I'd laugh all the way to the bank. I'd get in my car and drive around the school district, visit the schools. My title was Administrative Assistant Superintendent in charge of school, student, and community relations, with no job description, nobody to report to, nothing, you know. So I took that job and I made of it the best I could. You know, I'll have to go over this situation. Prior to the during the desegregation of the schools and so on, we had never had a black person elected to the Board of Education. We had one person to apply for and try back in the late 40s or early 50s, Mrs. ELIZA Williams. Mrs. ELIZA Williams promoted a wonderful campaign to be elected to the Board of Education. But she was defeated 10-1 at the polls. She polled more votes than did the president of the board the previous year. Still, she lost 10-1. The then Board of Education and Superintendent of Schools did not want, first of all, a black person on the board, nor did they want a woman on the board. So they set about defeating her, and they did. People were lined up around the block to vote in that school election. I said that to say this. Later, I prevailed upon Mr. Clarence Willis. I met him up in the corner, and I said to him, "Why don't you run for the Board of Education?" He said, "Well, I never thought about it." I said, "Well, do think about it, and I'll tell you how to go about getting all the necessary papers and such to run." He said, "Well, I tell you, I've already thought about it. I'm going to do it." So I said, "Well, you go down to the Board of Education office and get the papers and all, and circulate petition, that kind of thing, and become a candidate." So he did. In the Alton Township, there were only three people can be elected to the board at that time. 3 people in the Alton Township. There was only 1 vacancy at that time. So Mr. Willis was running for the vacancy in the Alton Township. And there was another white person who was running for the same vacancy. I decided that I would give Willis a better chance. So I personally wrote a letter to the white person who was a candidate for that position and explained to him in this letter that we black people had never had a representative on the Alton School Board. And now is the time, no better time than now, to correct that condition. The possibility of getting elected the way the school district is gerrymandered would be almost impossible in the first place. But there's one way we can get a black person elected, and that would be for you to withdraw from as a candidate and leave Willis unopposed, and he would be elected, the first black person to be elected to the Board of Education. And you know, the fellow went for it. He decided, well, he's right, and I'm going to withdraw, to the consternation of the then superintendent, who had already selected him to be the next board member. He went down to the Board of Education office and told him that I'm withdrawing. And when they asked him why, he told them. He did. So Willis was elected, the first black person elected to the Alton Board of Education. Not only did he serve well during his term, he served many more terms following that, and ultimately became the first black president of the Alton Board of Education. All started with this letter to get this guy to withdraw from his candidacy. That to me, perhaps, I think of all the things that I have been involved in through the years, that would be the one thing that I have been involved in that I'm just extremely proud of. Now, Mr. Willis doesn't know who wrote that letter.
I won't bring it up.
But he knows that it was written, but he doesn't know who did it.
I won't bring it up.
While in the school districts, I decided that there were some other things that I wanted to do, that there are other ways that I could serve my community, as well as in public education. And another reason why I was involved in myself that way was because I didn't feel that the then Board of Education administration, school administration, was giving me a fair break in the school system itself because of, simply because I'm black. I'll just put it as it is, because I'm black. If I had been white, I'd probably been superintendent of school. But since I'm black, I'm not going to be that. Okay, so you're not going to promote me into key positions to do things, then I'll do some things on the outside. I ran for alderman of the city of Alton, 5th Ward. People thought I was crazy. You never get elected. But the interesting part about it, I was assistant principal at Alton High at the time. And I did a lot of promoting there, behind the scenes. One of the things that helped me more than perhaps than anything else was that Alton High students went home and told their parents, we want you to vote for Mr. Bailey for alderman of the 5th Ward. Because some of those same parents came to me and talked to me about it. That's how I know they did it. Okay? So that happened. I was elected to the city council. First black person to ever be elected to the city government. it was rough going at the time. They wanted to talk down to me and that kind of thing, you know. Interestingly enough, I'll just say it like it is. Hey, I was the best qualified person there. I was the only college graduate and educated beyond college, graduate degree. The only one, not including the mayor. Including the mayor. I was the best educated person in the chamber. So why shouldn't I represent the people? Okay? Finally, they decided that, hey, this guy is not here representing black people. He's here representing the 5th Ward. And we're going to work with him on it. And I did a lot of things while there they didn't approve of. For example, I introduced a resolution to establish an open housing ordinance. Hey, that was the wrong thing. This community was not ready. Realtors and people who owned rental property and all that, they weren't ready for that kind of thing, but I pushed it anyway. The mayor tried to get me to withdraw it. I wouldn't do it. Hey, we're going to have a showdown here and now. We did get, fortunately, an open housing ordinance. But in order to get it, it had to be watered down to the extent that it really wasn't worth the paper it was written on. But we did have it on the books. I was city council during 10 years. During, first of all, Mayor Day was mayor at the time that I entered the city council. And following Mayor Day was Mayor Paul Lenz. And Mayor Lenz was there for, I think, for 16 years. So I served my 10 years under those 2 mayors. Wait a minute, I'm wrong in that. First of all, there was Mayor Day, and then Clyde Wiseman, and then Lenz. Another thing that I did while I was there, I don't attempt to take full credit for it, but I was behind the scenes operator. During that time, when I was a member of the city council, as I recall, we only had 1 black policeman, and we didn't have any black firemen. The 2 largest departments that we have in the city, and yet they weren't there. So behind the scenes, and working with Attorney Joe Bartolac, who filed a class action suit against the city, charging them with whatever for not employing black men in the police and fire departments. And a court decree was issued to the city, and it's still in existence, that they were to upgrade in the fire department and the police department the number of black people in positions equal to the ratio of population in the city of Alton. So we ran into a lot of opposition to that, but it did open the door for recruitment and ultimately employing a number of black policemen and several black firemen. And this decree is still in order. After serving 10 years on the city council, I decided that there were other things that I could do to make for a better life in the city of Alton. So we formed an organization to support for the office of mayor, Mr. Burt Woolner, who was who operated the downtown business. He agreed to run for office, thinking that he would never be elected. But we mobilized our support behind the man and was able to elect him over the Paul Lynch administration, which had been in place 16 years. That was a shock not only to the community but everywhere else. Mr. Woolner agreed that if we supported him, he would appoint some key people in his administration at City Hall. And when he was elected, he did what he had promised. The only thing he asked was if the black community would submit to him the names of qualified people that they could support and who would do a good job in their administration. And one of those people whose name was submitted was mine to become comptroller of the city of Alton. And he appointed me to the position, and the appointment was approved by the city council. I served in that position for 6 years, managing the total budget of the city of Alton. At that time, the total budget was better than $24 million a year. And the revenues coming from various sources. We didn't have the casino at that time, unfortunately, but we did manage very well the resources that we had in order to finance or fund the various departments and so on. That was one of the areas, too, that we could use, and if I may use the expression, to be able to force certain things to happen within the administration that had never happened before. For example, nowhere in City Hall at that time did you find a black person in position. Nowhere in City Hall. So my contention was you need to have at least a representation of black people in the City Hall. People come in to do business, they don't see any black people anyplace. So some of those departments then, by being pressured, did employ people to work in their departments. During my career as an educator, as I have mentioned before, I realized that I was endowed and blessed with abilities that were not being utilized by the school administration. So I sought to use those abilities in other ways. One of the ways that I chose to use those abilities was to build homes. When I was in college, in the Department of Construction, we built on campus several buildings from scratch, from foundation up. And I learned all of the crafts during that time. So I just sought to use those crafts. The first thing I did was to build my own home. My home on Salute Street, where I presently live. My wife and I built this home ourselves. We were 2.5 years building it. We did everything except the plastering, the wiring, and the plumbing. We laid the brick, we laid the foundation, we poured the concrete, we built the walls, the whole bit. We did all of it. And when I completed that job, first of all, people came along and laughed at me. Saying, "You're a school teacher, you don't know anything about building houses. What do you know about building houses?" Well, finally, as the walls went up and the roof went on, they decided, well, maybe he does know how to build a house. And then after I can close it in, they began come in and look around. So, well, the fellow does know how to build a house. But at any rate, we completed the house. Took us 2.5 years. We moved in. By the time we got in, other people wanted me to build houses for them, and I did so. Totally, we built 14 houses in the city of Alton for black people, and in all probability, most of those people would not have had or not have been able to employ a contractor to build the kind of house that they did, that we built for them, for the money that was involved in their building. So that was really a situation that I enjoyed doing. And again, this came about primarily because my abilities were not being used extensively by the authorities that had me employed to do certain things. And after retirement from the school district, I applied with the Thacker Construction Company. The Thacker Construction Company had signed a contract with Scott Air Force Base to maintain the family housing on the base. They had 1,875 units of family housing on Scott Air Force Base that had to be maintained. And the Thacker Construction Company had signed a contract with them to do that maintenance. Well, he gave me the opportunity to be the person in charge of that operation. We had 65 employees, full-time, and we maintained those around-the-clock emergency situations. We didn't do any major construction, only repair for damages that might have occurred by storm or otherwise. Other than that, we did the painting, the plumbing, the heating, the wiring, whatever had to be done to maintain those structures in livable condition was what we did. And it was a 3-year experience that was really wonderful for me. I learned a lot by that, and it was a very successful operation. Following that was the appointment by the mayor to be comptroller for the city of Alton. The Thacker Construction Company was a totally black-owned business at the time. Their major thrust was highway construction. They had not before had a maintenance contract. So it was their responsibility not only to build highways and streets and those kinds of things, but to maintain the construction, the family housing at Scott Air Force Base. Thacker Construction Company was a pretty big operation. They did not most, but all of the concrete work for the Atlanta National Airport, the runways and those kind of things. And they built runways for Scott Air Force Base also. So Thacker Construction Company was a totally black operation, headed by Floyd Thacker, who, by the way, was one of my students in junior high school. Well, life has been good to me, and I have been blessed with a wife and a family that has been supportive of me all the way. My wife and I have 2 sons. The oldest, of course, is James Marvin Bailey, Jr., who is a dentist, an orthodontist, practicing in Oakland, California. He's been practicing there for, I guess, close to 30 years, doing exceptionally well. My second son, Dwayne Leslie Bailey, is an attorney who has been a prosecuting attorney for Madison County State's Attorney's Office for, I guess, better than 12 years, and who also is doing exceptionally well in his career. He earned his law degree from Northwestern University, Chicago, and my oldest son, James, earned his dental degree and orthodontics degree from Howard University in Washington, D.C. So both are very highly professionally trained and doing an exceptionally good job. My oldest son, James, has 3 daughters and 1 son. The oldest daughter is Tori. She lives in Los Angeles, California. And the next is Lauren, who lives in Washington, D.C. And the youngest is Carmen. Carmen lives in Atlanta, Georgia. They're very closely knit group, and they keep in close touch with one another all the time. And then my oldest granddaughter, Tori, who lives in Los Angeles, has 2 little girls, our great-grandkids. Sasha is the oldest. I think she's about 10 or 11. And then Ilona is the youngest one, and she's maybe 5 or 6 years old. So we have quite a family. They're scattered all over, but it's a lovely family, and we're very pleased. My wife and I are very pleased to be the mother and father of such a family. The grandson is James Marvin Bailey III. He's the youngest of the grandkids. Yeah, he's I guess maybe 11 or 12. Of all the involvements that I have been blessed to work in through the years, the founding of the Elijah P. Lovejoy Memorial Association, I would consider my number one achievement. Early on, back way back, I won't go back too many years, but it was back in the 50s. Mr. Jesse London Cannon, Joseph A. Brewer, and I decided that we wanted to form an association, an Elijah P. Lovejoy Association. The purpose of that association would be to perpetuate the memory of Elijah P. Lovejoy and also provide scholarships for deserving students, high school graduates of the Alton area. And we set about getting a charter. We chartered that organization by the state as a nonprofit corporation, and then we set about setting up the scholarship fund. We did issue our first scholarship fund. I think it was $500 to Sterling Scales, who continued his education and became a dentist, and we supported him all through his sojourn through the years. And following that, we set up a sustaining fund, and we set up the drive to accumulate $100,000 as a sustaining fund, and the interest earned on that fund would be used to fund student scholarships. And through the years, although Mr. Cannon and Mr. Brewer have passed on, that scholarship fund has existed, not only existed, but thrived. I'm not sure at this moment how much that sustaining fund is, but I'm sure it's over $100,000. And I'm sure that we have issued scholarships to more than 100 students throughout the community. We set out at the beginning, once we got the organization going, then we recruited other people who were interested in supporting our effort. And the organization now is well and healthy, it's doing exceptionally well, and we have not only, we've done more than 2 generations of students. One of the students, Joyce Gill Robinson, received a scholarship years ago, and her son Eric Robinson has a scholarship, had a scholarship to get his education. Now Eric Robinson is president of the association. So we've done exceptionally well, and I'm very proud of that, having been a member of that organization and helping be one of the founders. One of the things that I guess I'm most proud of is how during the years of crisis, during the desegregation of schools and so on, that I was able to get businesses and industries in the area to open their doors for employment of black people in the areas where black people had not been employed before. If I just might cite a few, for example, the First National Bank downtown at that time maybe had a black janitor, but they never had anybody in the, teller or any other position. And I won't take full credit for all this, but I did seize the opportunity resulting from the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and the aftermath of that, how the riots all over the country, well, not all over the country, but in many places, developed. Property was destroyed and all that kind of thing. And I said to the then Rotary Club and other business leaders, why wait for this kind of thing to happen in our community? Why don't you just open the door now without coercion, at your own free will, and employ people who are qualified to do jobs? We're not asking a handout. We're asking you to make available employment for people who are qualified to do the jobs that you have done. And I told one of the officers at First National Bank that at that time, he said to me, well, Jim, I don't know what'll happen if we hire a black person in here behind the teller. I don't know what'll happen. I said, but I'll tell you what, I know what'll happen if a bunch come here and lock themselves across your door and cut off your flow of traffic. He said, do you think that would happen? I said, I don't think it would happen, but it could, It's happened right over here in St. Louis, just next door. It could happen here. So why don't you just give it a chance? Give the people an opportunity. And as a result of that, we had opened up their First National Bank, Pioneer First Federal Building and Loan, Alton Water Company, Union Electric, the Illinois Bell Telephone, Germania Savings and Loan, Wedge Bank, and on and on and on. They hired people to work in there, and not only did they hire them to work in there, they put them out where they could plainly be seen. Plainly be seen. And these people did wonderful jobs. They got along real well. The problems that they anticipated happening did not happen. It was just a matter of doing what should be done without being coerced.